I can confirm to the House that we are overturning the suspension of UNRWA funding. Yeah. Britain will provide £21 million in new funds, some directed at supporting the management reforms recommended by the Kelowna Review, and UNRWA supports more than 5.5 million Palestinians. Almost 200 of their staff have died through this conflict. Israel promised a flood of aid back in April, but imposes impossible and unacceptable restrictions. Settlement expansion and settler violence has reached record levels. The Israeli government has seized more of the West Bank in 2024 than the past 20 years.
I call the Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, with permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement on the situation in the Middle East. I was very disappointed to miss yesterday's Foreign Affairs debate due to the EPC summit, and I welcome this early opportunity to come to the House. Last weekend, I visited Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, meeting leaders on both sides. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has also spoken to both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas, and I've discussed the issue with colleagues from the G7 and, of course, the region. This has been a priority from day one because of the desperate situation in Gaza and the serious risk of escalation in Lebanon in particular. And I have to be frank, Britain wants an immediate ceasefire. The fighting must stop. The hostages must be released. Much, much more aid must enter Gaza. Israel promised a flood of aid back in April, but imposes impossible and unacceptable restrictions. And there must be de-escalation on the Israeli-Lebanese border. I sincerely hope the parties agree a ceasefire urgently, and I've been discussing with partners the need for planning for what follows, on reconstruction, on governance and security, and for reforming the empowering the Palestinian Authority. But President Biden presented his proposals almost 2 months ago, so this new government has not sought to cloak our position with qualifications or conditions. The horror must end now. Mr. Speaker, my visit brought home the conflict's appalling impact. I met the families of those murdered and taken hostage so cruelly by Hamas, now separated from their loved ones for so long. I told them that the UK will continue to push for an immediate release of all hostages. I also met Palestinians displaced by settlers. Settlement expansion and settler violence has reached record levels. The Israeli government has seized more of the West Bank in 2024 than the past 20 years. This is completely unacceptable. This government will challenge those who undermine a two-state solution. Finally, I met aid workers from the UN agencies operating in Gaza. More aid workers have been killed in Gaza than at every conflict globally combined this year. Those who risk their lives to save others are heroes. With journalists banned from entering, aid agencies are also a vital source of information from the Strip, and their reports are devastating. Almost 40,000 killed, mothers so malnourished they cannot produce milk for their babies. Rivers of sewage in the streets, a surge in disease among children, 40 times the normal rate of diarrhoea. Polio now detected. Looting, with one aid truck driver killed only yesterday. I announced on my visit the new funding for field hospitals run by UK Med, who have treated more than 60,000 Gazans since the conflict began. Mr. Speaker, humanitarian aid is a moral necessity in the face of such a catastrophe, and it is aid agencies who ensure UK support reaches civilians on the ground. UNRWA is absolutely central to these efforts. No other agency can deliver aid at the scale needed It's already feeding over half of Gaza's population. It will be vital for future reconstruction, and it provides critical services to Palestinian refugees in the region. I was appalled by the allegations that UNRWA staff were involved in the 7th of October attacks, but the UN took these allegations seriously. I've spoken to UN Secretary General Guterres and Commissioner Lazzarini. We are reassured that after Catherine Colonna's independent review, UNRWA is ensuring they meet the highest standards of neutrality and strengthening its procedures, including on vetting. UNRWA has acted. Partners like Japan, the European Union and Norway have also now acted. This government will act too. I can confirm to the House that we are overturning the suspension of UNRWA funding. Yeah. Britain will provide 21 million in new funds, some directed at supporting the management reforms recommended by the Colonna Review, and UNRWA supports more than 5.5 million Palestinians. Almost 200 of their staff have died through this conflict. I thank them for this life-saving work. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we also look for a pathway out of the wider crisis. I'm conscious of this conflict's complexities, determined to listen to all sides and approach every decision I must take carefully. Our overarching goal is clear: a viable, sovereign Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. There is no way out of this crisis without a route to both Palestinians and Israelis enjoying security, justice, and opportunity in lands that they can call their own. We are committed to playing a full diplomatic role in a renewed peace process and to contributing to that process by recognising a Palestinian state at a time we determine, not anyone else. I know there are other aspects of the crisis that are of great interest to this House. The government's assessment of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza, the investigation by the International Criminal Court, and what further measures might help deter malign activity by the Iranian regime. Let me reassure the House that I take these issues extremely seriously. Our commitment to international law is clear. We are following the necessary processes. As soon as I took office, I tasked officials with a comprehensive review of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law, and that process is now underway. I will update the House again once the process is complete. Mr. Deputy Speaker, 24 years ago, just weeks after I first joined this House, President Clinton hosted the Camp David Summit, a reminder that this tragedy has lasted far, far too long. There are those in this House who, like me, represent constituents convinced the world does not understand Israel's predicament. To them I say, Israel is in a tough neighbourhood, threatened by those who want it annihilated. There is no equivalence between Israel's democratic government and Hamas, a terrorist organisation responsible for an act of barbarism on October the 7th that sought to kill countless Israelis and provoke wider conflict with Palestinians. I fully supported the UK's role in defending Israel when Iran launched its unprecedented attack, and I utterly condemn the Houthi attack on Tel Aviv overnight. There are also those who, like me, represent constituents convinced the world does not understand the depth of Palestinian suffering. To them I say, civilians in Gaza are trapped in hell on earth, and the Palestinian people have been in purgatory for decades, denied the state that is their inalienable right. As Foreign Secretary, I understand both these perspectives. I recognise the pain and anguish felt on all sides. It makes me only more determined to do all I can in this office to advance the cause of peace. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Opposition Spokesman Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I start by welcoming the Secretary of State and his shadow team to their places. They take up their roles in one of the greatest offices of state, who are committed to shaping the future and the safety of our country. And that is, after all, the foremost duty of our government. I'd also like to take this opportunity to put on record my thanks to Lord Cameron, Lord Ahmed, and of course the Shadow Foreign Secretary, for their steadfast determination towards ending this conflict their humanity that they displayed when faced with a situation of untold horror. And I'd also like to thank them because in my previous role as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, they kept both me and both opposition frontbenchers fully updated, and I'm sure the government will continue with this collaborative approach. I also thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement, although I cannot say that it prepared me fully to find myself on the front bench this Friday morning. The Right Honourable Gentleman will know of the extensive work we undertook in government following the horrific terrorist attack suffered by Israel on the 7th of October and the crimes against humanity suffered by her people. I welcome his visit to the region. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Israel did suffer an appalling terrorist attack. It was the deadliest in their history. And as we said from the outset, Israel has the right to defend itself in accordance with international humanitarian law. And we must remove Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel. As the Right Honourable Gentleman rightly sets out, the situation in Gaza is desperate. Too many Palestinian civilians have been killed. We continue to see strikes on humanitarian infrastructure, and the humanitarian situation is unforgivable. The Index on Famine states that Gaza is now in just that, full famine. And I saw this when I went on my own visit to the Egyptian border with Gaza and met with families who had had to be evacuated due to the severity of the harm caused to them. We need an immediate end to the fighting and to secure the release of the hostages, whose families continue to suffer unbearable torment on a daily basis. So can he please provide an update to this House on reassurances he has received on the safety of those hostages? On aid, has he secured any reassurances in his meetings to increase the number of trucks going into Gaza, because 70 odd a day is just not enough? In government, we did everything we could to urge Israel to let more humanitarian aid into Gaza, opening more crossings, whether through Rafah. We trebled our own aid commitment within the last financial year, doing everything we could to get aid there by land, sea or air. We had success in getting the Ashdod port open, as well as Karim Shalom, as well as helping in 11 airdrops into Gaza and creating a field hospital. The UK aid funding to UK Med has treated thousands of patients. We also supported and helped set up a maritime aid corridor to Gaza. Now, he announces today the return of funding to UNRWA. Can he please advise the House on the timeline for this and also provide assurances that taxpayers' funding will be directed with due regard? Now, only an end to the fighting will enable a significant scaling up of humanitarian aid. Now, Right Honourable Gentleman rightly states that Biden set forward a proposal backed by Israel and the UN Security Council to end the hostilities. So what action is the Right Honourable Gentleman taking to move that proposal forward? Can he also provide us with any reassurances he has secured in his meetings with Netanyahu? He also rightly raises the case of extremist settlers. We put in place sanctions against some of those extremist settlers, one of the first governments to do so. So can he assure us that he raised this issue with the Israeli government and whether more sanctions will be forthcoming? Now, the risk of escalation remains high, particularly with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So can I please ask, following the sham election of the Iranian president, whether his department assesses any change in Iranian intent, activities or funding? When he sat on these benches, both the Right Honourable Gentleman and the now Home Secretary were crystal clear that they would prescribe the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps would they be in government. So can we please now have the timing for this prescription? We all want to see an end to this devastating situation, which threatens the stability and security of so many. As His Majesty's loyal opposition, our priority will be work with the government, but also to challenge and scrutinise you as needed. But ultimately, we on these benches can assure you we will always work in the national interest, because it is foreign policy that keeps our people safe at home, and that is our foremost duty.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Rutland and Stamford for her remarks in the House this morning and for her work previously on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, in which she was a stalwart champion for international humanitarian law, and she raised these issues frequently in the House, challenging both sides on the issues that she thought was important, and I'm pleased to see her elevated to this position. And can I put on record that I am grateful for the work that I was able to do with the former Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, and the way that he kept us in opposition in those days up to date with what was happening in our national interests, and of course to the member for Sutton Coldfield for all of his work, particularly on the issue of development when he was in office. She asked me about the safety of the hostages. This is of primary concern. And of course, in detailed conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu, we were engaged in what support we can offer to assist in that business of getting those hostages out. I met with hostage families, many of them UK hostage families, to discuss the plight of those hostages. They remain paramount in this government's mind, as I hope we head towards that ceasefire that we all want. She's right to centre her remarks on the question of aid. 70 trucks a day, when we know that it should be 500, is not enough. Yeah, absolutely right. And all of this House recognised the phrase flood. We were told in April that they would flood Gaza with aid. 70 is no way near enough. And as a consequence of that, when we hear the stories of disease, now polio, setting in Gaza, it is horrific and troubles us all deeply. Let me reassure her that we allocated an extra 5.5 million to support UK Med in Gaza, because those field sites are so important against a backdrop in which hospitals and medical facilities have been pummeled and bombed into the ground. She's absolutely right to focus on the Biden plan. We would like to see that Biden plan adopted in the next few days. And it's my sincere hope, and this dominated discussion with G7 foreign ministers in Washington, D.C. Last week, and in the conversations that I've had with Arab partners, all of us want to see that deal done, and sincerely hope that we get to that point by the end of this month. There is a sticking point. The sticking point, of course, is with prisoner release as well as hostage release. And the sticking point is what happens on that day after. I think Israel's security is paramount. Hamas cannot remain in charge of Gaza. But equally, the IDF cannot remain situated in Gaza. There has to be a new paradigm. It will involve, I suspect, Arab partners and others that can give the security guarantees to Israel. It's a complicated picture. We have to work at pace at what comes afterwards. She's right to raise the terrible situation on the West Bank. It was very important for me to meet with the new Prime Minister on the West Bank to discuss the finances that have been withdrawn, to discuss the free bar situation that we saw on the West Bank, and the horrors of an unbelievable expansion against a backdrop in which this breaches international law that this House stands by. And I pressed the Prime Minister in Israel on this issue greatly, and of course we are looking closely at those issues. And on Iran and the role that Iran plays in sponsoring Hamas, sponsoring Hezbollah, and engaged in malign activity, we keep a close eye. And I stand by what I said at this dispatch box as opposition spokesman on these matters, and I will work over the coming months to review the context of terrorist activity and state threats with my colleague, the Home Secretary, in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah. Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend to his position. What discussions has he had with regard to a hostage deal to secure the release of the hostages? And can he inform the House as to the welfare of the remaining hostages?
It has now been many months indeed. It is sadly possible that some of those hostages are no longer alive, and there are some reports that some of them have lost their life. When I spoke to hostage families, aware that their, in this case, sons may be no longer with us, of course, like any parent, they wanted the body returned. But then there are hostages still in tunnels. Parents, brothers, sisters, families, unaware as to their health at this point in time. And we will continue to do all we can, working with Israeli authorities to, and important nations in this regard, like Qatar, able to speak to Hamas in a way that this government is unable to do, to ensure their release.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. May I welcome the Foreign Secretary to his place. The situation in Gaza is, frankly, soul-shattering. It's been 300 days nearly. The death toll is at 38,000, the vast majority killed being women and children. Only 3 days ago, 22 people lost their lives in a strike on a UN-run school. That's the 5th attack on or near a school in the last 8 days. And those who survive the bombings are at severe risk of disease and malnutrition on the backdrop of a medical system that has been completely decimated. So can I warmly welcome the restoration of funding to UNRWA as a backbone of Gazan society. But the number of deaths will only increase exponentially with the founding of polio. In the Lancet, it was estimated it might reach 186,000. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this has to end now. We need that immediate ceasefire, but we need also those hostages out and the aid to come in. But it is also right we start thinking about not just the next day, but how do we stop this from ever happening again? And there is only one viable answer to that, and that is the two-state solution. That is our North Star. It's the keystone to stability in the region as well. But I have to express disappointment that the Foreign Secretary refuses to pull the lever that would best signify our commitment to it, which is to recognise the Palestinian state on 1967 borders. Ireland, Spain and Norway did it this May. Will he consider it? And if he won't, why not? The Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, actively rejects a Palestinian state. And we know that it is Hamas's rallying cry, the fact that it doesn't exist. We must prove them wrong. So what is he doing to ensure it will happen? The ICC also has issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu, Gallant and Hamas leaders. But there is confusion over the Foreign Secretary's position on the block. Will he clarify that for the House today? And finally, would he consider meeting with me so that we can work together across the aisle to advance the cause of that immediate ceasefire, but most important, that enduring peace and that two-state solution?
Hear, hear.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, not just for her remarks, but for the ways that she has taken up these issues in the last Parliament, and I'm sure she will continue in this Parliament. And we are all reminded of the plight of her own family in Gaza in those early months particularly. And can I welcome her support for the restoring of funding to UNRWA. Many of our allies made that decision now months ago, back in April, May. I'm only sorry it has taken a change of government to look at this clearly and reach this point. And she is absolutely right to raise the issues of huge concern in relation to polio taking hold now in Gaza, alongside the tremendous growth in respiratory disease and, of course, in diarrhea. And it's right to say that both those two conditions can lead to death if untreated. There is no confusion on this party's position on Palestinian recognition. We are committed to Palestinian recognition. We hope to work with partners to achieve that when the circumstances are right. And I say to the Honourable Lady that it is my sincere hope that that Biden plan is adopted in the coming weeks, that we get to the immediate ceasefire that this party has now been calling for since, well, it's now a good almost 8 months since we've been calling for an immediate ceasefire. And under those circumstances, we can work with others because Palestinian recognition is not the end in of itself. It is actually a two-state solution that is the end in of itself that we want to achieve. And she's right to say that the chief prosecutor at the ICC has made his intention clear in relation to arrest warrants, but she will know that there are further hearings to determine whether they will actually be issued. We have been 2 weeks in office. It is right that I allow Treasury solicitors, lawyers and the Attorney General to assist me in any judgments that we would have to make in relation to that. I said in my statement that there's a process. It's a quasi-legal process. It's one that must be followed with all integrity, and I intend to do that.
Paul Wall.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement today, which is a real relief, particularly his description of the hellhole that is Gaza. Many of my constituents in Rochdale feel deeply appalled by the ongoing deaths and suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza, but they're also deeply appalled by the rising tide of settler violence and expansion in the West Bank. And many of them are really desperate for peace in the region, as many of us in this House are today. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary specifically what specific steps he's taking to actively promote and uphold the independence of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice?
Well, can I state very clearly that we are clear. Sorry, I should welcome the new member for Rochdale to his place. It's great to see him there. I know he long held an ambition to move from journalism to this House. We are clear that the International Criminal Court is the primary international institution for investigating and prosecuting the most serious international crimes, and we respect fully the rules-based order and the ICC's independence and impartiality. And on the ICJ, we're of course aware that there is an advisory opinion likely to be issued very shortly, and we will consider it very, very carefully.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Right Honourable Member to his role, and I think both sides of the House want to see critical aid getting through where it's needed. But I am concerned by the government's decision to resume funding to the UNRWA. UNRWA schools have been repeatedly used by terrorists to both store weapons and launch attacks, and over 100 UNRWA staff have had links to terrorist groups in the region. Is the Right Honourable Gentleman able to give the UK taxpayers the reassurance that they need to know that an unequivocal assurance that Hamas has no links to UNRWA in Gaza?
Well, can I say I had the pleasure of meeting Catherine Colonna in her role as the Foreign Secretary for France. She's a woman of tremendous capability and integrity. She looked at these issues in depth. She reported, and all of our allies have continued to fund UNRWA. But she did make a series of recommendations, and of course that was why I spoke to the UN Secretary General and the Commissioner Lazzarini, responsible for UNRWA, to ensure that they are implementing the action plan that came out as a consequence of that review. And in finding the money available for UNRWA and restoring its funding, I've also ensured that there is £1 million of funding to ensure that we support the implementing of those recommendations.